From slamming judges for poor decisions to calling out Dana White for terrible matchups, UFC commentator Joe Rogan has always been a vocal personality in the game. And this time around, Joe has suggested an outrageous new method for scoring fights. He thinks the scoring should be crowdsourced. Some of you might be surprised, but me, personally, not at all. The 55-year-old is known for suggesting unique solutions that sometimes tend to be a bit too out of the box, if you know what I mean. And if you ask me, I think events like UFC 281 and 284 have sort of taken their toll on the commentator.
Oh my word! It is absolute pandemonium in Shenzhen, China. Jessica Andrade relied on the fight.
He recently suggested this outrageous solution of having the crowd score fights instead of the judges. And before I even talk about the obvious shortcomings of this plan, I just want to get one thing out of the way. Did Joe come up with this on the spot? Because anyone who spends at least 5 minutes thinking about this scoring method knows it's a bad idea. I mean, how in the world is it even supposed to work? Sure, you could have everyone in the arena download an app to score the fight afterward, but what about credibility? At least everyone knows the judges, right? But what's the UFC going to do about a fan sitting in row E on seat 42 who scored the fight 50-0 in favor of his favorite fighter? It's just not possible. And that brings me to my next point. Isn't this just taking the home crowd advantage factor to the next level? Alexander Volkanovski would have won at UFC 284. Islam would win every single fight in Abu Dhabi. And don't even get me started about Conor in Ireland. Just imagine for a second that Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor was scheduled to take place in Dublin. Chandler would be a fool for even competing, right? Or look at it this way. Since the native fighter has more fans in attendance, it's obvious they'd win every single time, right? Or how Dubai is full of Dagestani supporters every time one of their fighters has a match. It's taking the home crowd advantage to the next level. And don't get me wrong, I agree with Joe here. I think there needs to be some serious revision as to how fights are scored. But this can never work. Also, I think Rogan sort of caught on after sharing his brilliant suggestion. Shortly after he talked about crowdsourcing the result,
and you like a lot of people don't know. They don't know when they can hit someone, when someone can hit them.
Yeah.
And if you think someone's going to hit you and you can't get some space between them, you have to be ready.
he said any fighter could just tell their fans to vote for them regardless of how the fight plays out. Or, in other words, whoever has more fans in the building ends up winning. And imagine if you didn't even have to be in the arena to vote. You could get access to the voting system by purchasing a PPV. Then obviously the fighter with richer and more fans would win every time. But yeah, like I said before, some of you might be surprised, but not me. Joe is known for being all out there and coming up with all sorts of ideas. But then again, it's not about what he's suggesting, it's about what he's trying to hint at here. There's obviously a problem with the scoring. The fans are always going to side with their favorite fighter. There's no doubt about it. But the truth is, there's a problem with the scoring. When it's close, like 49-47 close, you can't really slam the judges for making the wrong decision. But when one fighter is clearly bashing his opponent, and one of the judges scores it 45-50, that's when things get a bit tricky. It makes you wonder whether everyone was even watching the same fight or not. And don't get me started about the Volks versus Islam fight, because that was super close.
Can't wait till I see this man break. I'm going to break him like I've done everybody else with my cardio. And what you're seeing is not a break, but you're seeing Volkanovski use his cardio to make this an even fight as he can. His cardio.
Could it have gone either way? Well, yes. But when Joe calls it a robbery in broad daylight, I don't necessarily agree. What's the point of telling you all this? Well, it's the root of the problem. It's not about how the judges score the fight. It's about the factors they use to score the fight. Take control time, for example. There's no denying Volka did more damage that night at UFC 284. But if we're talking about control time, Makhachev was all over him.
Got a point to prove in that department. Not that he was going to strictly fight there, but... And this is where he's so strong in this tie clinch as well. Volkanovski working through it, getting in the hand fighting, doing the right things.
It's Volk.
And since control time is worth more than damage done, that's probably why the judges gave him more rounds. It isn't rocket science, people. Taking power away from the judges won't solve a thing, but defining the entire criteria might just make things a little better. Sugar Sean O'Malley also thinks change is needed, but he has a different idea. Something way more different than what Joe thinks. Before I tell you what the bantamweight title contenders said, I just want to make this clear. Whoever says they aren't biased is usually biased. On a recent episode of Bromley, Sugar said it's actually the Sports Commission hiring these judges, which needs to do a better job. Instead of just hiring anyone who walks in the door, they should spend time looking at their track records, because one mistake can cost a fighter their entire career.
I definitely didn't think what I did watch of the fight. I didn't think it was a robbery. I didn't think Volk got robbed, but it was a lot closer than everyone was expecting.
So it's not so much about how the fights are being scored, it has more to do with the people scoring the fight. Get it? You can't expect an incompetent judge to give a competent decision, right? And that's exactly what O'Malley is preaching. It's not a competition, but it's still a much better idea than Joe's. But yeah, I still think it has more to do with what the fight is scored on. Did you know aggression is awarded more points than octagon control? Yep. So if a fighter comes out all swinging and fails to connect, they still get points for being aggressive. Or look at it this way. Imagine a fighter all calm and composed, just waiting for his opponent to land in an awkward position. He's moving back every time his opponent advances, but because he's not being aggressive, he'll actually lose points in that round. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But wait, it gets crazier. Say McGregor and Chandler are fighting. Every time McGregor steps forward to swing, Chandler ducks and steps back, trying to bring the Irishman into the middle. Chandler lands a quick jab before backing off again to avoid a fury of punches. Technically, Iron did more damage. He actually landed a punch instead of wild swinging. But since Conor was more aggressive, he'll end up winning. From the outside, that seems like a huge robbery. But from the judge's perspective, that's actually the right decision. They're not just scribbling numbers on a card, they're going off the criteria. The best way to bring a change is to change the criteria, or judge the entire fight instead of a round. Instead of adding up the numbers and going round by round, why not just look at the entire fight? Like, say, if a fighter beats the living daylights out of his opponent for the first 4 rounds, but in the last, his opponent comes out and just whacks him around like a rag doll. He makes one of the greatest comebacks ever, and truly deserves to win, but since judges go off numbers, his exceptional comeback won't mean a thing. So maybe if the UFC just ditched the idea of scoring the fight by rounds and looked at things as a whole, things might just get better. But as far as Rogan's idea of scoring goes, I don't think it would ever work, and I have nothing against him. He's usually right when it comes to MMA, because the guy has been around for nearly 30 years, and UFC scoring does need to be revised, but just not Joe's way. Anyway, that's what the UFC commentator had to say, and we'll see you in the next one.